All right, welcome back to the show. At this time, we are joined by Michael Bratton, aka SCC Mike. He's the news editor at Saturday Down South, as well as the host of that SEC podcast. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to do it with the doctor, SEC longtime follower, been a big fan, so this is a treat for me.
Well, man, I appreciate that, and I feel the same way because I've got to tell you, there's not a whole lot of people out there that put really good content, for all 14 teams. You'll have somebody that puts for, Alabama or Georgia or one of these teams, but you do a great job with all 14 teams. And one of the things that you do a lot of times is you'll make different lists or power rankings, and you don't always go with the status quo, and I appreciate that, but you tend to dig in and try to form your own opinion and your own analysis from that, and just do a terrific job with that. But as you know well, when you do that, it tends to stir up different fan bases and cause some social media chaos. But I always appreciate the fact that you give your very best and most sincere analysis of what you think is going to happen.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of value, for anyone listening out there, maybe kind of young in this field, but there's a lot of value in, you don't want to just have, one of these wild hot takes to be a wild hot take guy,
Right.
but if you have a strong sense that maybe this team or this player or what have you, this conference is really going to exceed or fall below the expectations, and you can kind of back that up with some logic there. I think you really gotta put it out there and stand behind it, and get ready for criticism because the criticism is going to come. But as long as you put some research into it, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And that's what I've always tried to do.
Absolutely. And what's different in what we do and what others do is the fact that we cover all 14 teams. So every time you do something or post something or say something, you're probably going to make 13 of other teams angry. And so the reality is that the odds are not in your favor really to always get a kind response, if you will. But that's okay because our job is just to put honest content out there. Now, one of the lists that you did most recently, you listed and ranked the top quarterbacks coming back in the SEC. And I found this list intriguing for many reasons, but once again, it was a list that went kind of against the grain of what we've been seeing thus far. I want to read those top five quarterbacks that you listed because I think it's very intriguing how different this list is to many. First, you list Kyle Trask, number one, University of Florida, then Kellen Mond from Texas A&M, then John Rye Plumlee from Ole Miss. Number four, you got Bo Nix, and number five, Jamie Newman. Now, I won't start your number one, Kyle Trask from Florida, because most lists that are coming out have either Jamie Newman number one or Kellen Mond from Texas A&M number one. But here you got Kyle Trask number one. What is it about Trask that you like so much that you ranked him number one?
Well, I've just been so impressed with him last season, stepping up. Obviously, the first game came on the road there, had to fill in for an injured Felipe Franks. And, Florida was not really running at high gear at that time. It looked like all indication. And then, of course, you lose your starting quarterback. You're like, my goodness,
Right.
Kentucky is going to do it again, beat Florida for the second year in a row. And then in comes Kyle Trask. And the guy, Kentucky made him beat him, and he did just that. Big win there for the Gators. And then they basically went on a roll the rest of the season. I know they lost to LSU and they lost to Georgia, but at no point did I feel that it was Kyle Trask that was costing them the game. And I don't know, I'm just really impressed, just given the fact, like I said, didn't enter the season as a starter. Now he's going to have, although it's an interesting offseason now because of current events, but I was looking at this with the entire offseason, the entire spring, as not, we've seen Dan Mullen say not the presumed starter, but all indications are if Florida really wants to exceed expectations, take that next step up, I think it's going to come from the arm of Kyle Trask. And just based on what the limited, half a season of him starting we've seen, I think he's fully capable. And also the little caveat of Dan Mullen, just his strong track record. I was never a big fan of Felipe Franks, but he even got outstanding production from Felipe Franks. So just all those factors combined, that's why I've got Kyle Trask as my number one quarterback at the moment.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. You talk about the success that Dan Mullen has had with quarterbacks. It seems like really whoever you put in there, he does a good job of playing to their strengths and really hiding a lot of their weaknesses, I think. But number three is one that really interests me, and I want to talk to you about that, and that is Plumlee. And I like this pick because, he's got a new head coach, had some success last year, new head coach in Lane Kiffin. Are you expecting that Kiffin factor to really kick in with Plumlee?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. Now, obviously, he's a baseball player too, so I'm really going to have egg on my face if he, for whatever reason, says, I'm giving up football, but I've not heard any indication that's going to happen. But, man, for anyone that's not seen this kid play, I mean, just a truly, truly dynamic playmaker. For those that don't know the recruiting story, it's well known, but a long-time Georgia commit. I don't think Kirby Smart was fully committed to this kid playing quarterback, so they took, I believe it was a guy that was formerly up there at Ohio State, Mathis. So they kind of switched those out. Plumlee kind of had to figure out where to go from there. Obviously landed at Ole Miss, but I mean, just go back and watch this kid. I know Ole Miss football 4-8, that wasn't too exciting last year, but anytime he got on the field, starting from the very first snap I saw him in the Cal game, Ole Miss offense was stagnant basically the entire game. And this kid was like fireworks. I mean, he's like a mini version of Michael Vick. He's just an outstanding playmaker. Then the following week had to do it on the road against Alabama. You're like, okay, well, Cal's one thing, Alabama's another. He did basically the same thing against Alabama, but Ole Miss just had no answer for that offense, so kind of overshadowed. And as we saw that, towards the end of the year, he was doing the same thing against LSU, national champions. I don't know, this kid – I didn't have a ton of faith in Rich Rodriguez to develop a passing quarterback. So you kind of hit on it there with Lane Kiffin coming in. I think he can really take that next step with John Rice Plumlee. Heck, we've seen Lane Kiffin take former running back Blake Sims and Alabama win the SEC. So you're telling me he's taken over a dynamic player, athlete like John Rice Plumlee, a lot of people say this kid can't throw the ball. I don't think they've watched him enough to make that declaration. He's had some nice moments in the passing game as well, but I just think he's going to take a massive leap with Lane Kiffin, and that's why I've got him so high on my board.
You're 100% correct. When you think about what Lane Kiffin was able to do at Alabama with Blake Sims, who was not by any stretch of the imagination a quarterback by nature, and the success he was able to have with him. And I think Plumlee's a guy that has a lot more natural talent, a lot more natural ability. And I also think that, a lot of people are not, and I talked about this a little bit earlier in the show, a lot of people are not crediting the amount of talent that Lane Kiffin is inheriting on the offensive side of the football. I mean, when you think about a player like Jerrion Ely, the young running back who's also a baseball player, coming out of, a smaller school at Jackson Prep, a lot of people maybe overlooked him thinking he trying to discredit what he did at Jackson Prep because it was a smaller private school in the MAIS, but he came into the SEC and showed not only did he deserve to be here, but he's going to be a star in this league. And when you look at some of the players like that, and Plumlee, I mean, really Kiffin did a good job of finding an assignment and a head coaching job that's got a lot of young talent to build around.
Yeah, and you look at Ole Miss, like I said, 4-8 last year, nothing to brag about, but go back and watch those games. The Cal game, that was the controversy at the end of the game where it looked like Ole Miss scored a touchdown. For whatever reason, that referee crew did not review it. I mean, that game could have been turned. The Texas A&M game late in the year, I know Texas A&M didn't have an outstanding season, but Ole Miss, in my opinion, outplayed them. But what it was players like Plumlee making mistakes, freshman mistakes, carelessness with the ball, turning it over. So Texas A&M won by 7. Following week, they played Auburn. That was a 6-point ball game. I mean, Ole Miss had the ball to win it there at the end. They weren't able to get it done. Then, of course, we all know the fiasco there with the kick in the Egg Bowl. But you're talking a few of these games go a different direction. Ole Miss is a bowl team. So, yeah, I like what you have to say there. I think Lane Kiffin probably inheriting a little bit more talent than a lot of people give him credit for.
All right, another couple guys I want to talk about. Number 4 here, you've got Bo Nix, who as a freshman showed flashes of what he could be. He was inconsistent as a passer, but definitely showed moments where you could see a potential to be a star in this league. What do you see in Nix that has you ranking him this high?
Well, I think the thing with Bo Nix, and this is nothing against, any of the SEC listeners out there, because we're all guilty of it, but, when you see a true freshman out there and maybe he doesn't have that great of a season. I like to, I call it South Carolina syndrome now because they were all high on Jake Bentley, and then they were out on him. Now they were moved on to Ryan Helinski. Now some fans, believe it or not, are out on him. They want to see what Luke Doty, the freshman's got. So I think we got a little bit of that going on with Bo Nix because, like you said, very inconsistent at times during the season. But I think it was really, I don't know if you want to say unfair because he was a touted prospect, but I think Auburn had the team to compete for the SEC championship last season, and I think it was more the offensive line than it was issues with Bo Nix. But for whatever reason, just wasn't able to get that consistency throughout the season. I saw more of it towards the tail end of the season, but I just like him in big moments. He's a gutsy player. I think they need to run him more. If they were able to do that last season, I think that would have really opened up the offense. And now with Chad Morris coming in, I like to make fun of Chad Morris more than anybody probably in the SEC for what we saw at Arkansas. But I do have some faith in him as an offensive coordinator and a quarterback coach. Not a ton, but a little bit. But I think with a player like Bo Nix, with the potential he's got, now with Gus Malzahn and Chad Morris kind of developing his talents, I think he's going to take a big step from where people are looking at him like, he was costing Auburn games last year. I think this year he steps up to where he's the reason they're winning them.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I tell you, it reminds me a little bit, not skill set wise by any stretch of the imagination, but his freshman year reminds me a little bit of the freshman year that Matthew Stafford had. You remember the big touted coming in, everybody was, all about him. Then he got thrown into the fire pretty quickly. And, that year he threw 7 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. I mean, that was nothing spectacular by any stretch of the imagination. But you saw things in him that made you believe, okay, this guy is going to be a ball player. And one thing I like about Bo Nix, I think is really going to help him is, we know that what happens the sophomore year so many times, right? The sophomore slump, if you will, or a drop off of some measure. But he's got something that normally doesn't happen is he's a coach's kid, right? Like his dad's going to have him. He's going to be working. He knows what it takes. It's a little bit different situation. I think Bo Nix is going to come back ready. And more importantly, I think he's got a ton of skill coming back around him. Now, that offensive line is going to be a mess. They've got to figure that out. But at the skill positions, at wide receiver, running back, they got a ton of talent coming back, and that really should be beneficial for them.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I got him so high. And I think the ceiling is very, very high for Bo Nix coming into this season, and I think he's going to prove a lot of people wrong.
Absolutely. Now let's move to number 5, probably the most controversial of the group, and that is how far down you have Jamie Newman, the University of Georgia transfer. What is it that you've seen that's got Jamie Newman at number 5? Is it something that you don't like about him, or you haven't seen enough of him, or is it just you don't like what's around him as much?
No, I think it has a little bit more to do with him. And if anybody missed it, I did do a column on him. It was pretty popular. It was a film study of. I went back and watched every Jamie Newman play I could find on Wake Forest. Not all of them were available, but the vast majority were. And, there was plenty of positives to take away from it. And particularly his downfield accuracy I thought was outstanding at Wake Forest, and his physicality in the run game. He's not a guy that I think is going to be able to blow by many defenders in the SEC at the second and third level, particularly not the safeties and quarterbacks and what have you. But, he'll be able to outrun all the defensive linemen. But, in the SEC, it's just a different animal, So yeah. I just don't think he's going to be quite the game breaker a lot of people are making him out to be. Now, obviously, he's going to be surrounded with a lot more talent than he ever was at Wake Forest. But watching him in some of these big marquee games, I don't know. I'm not seeing where all these people are getting him. I guess maybe it's a little bit more of a reaction of I'm getting just blown away by all these, Jamie Newman for Heisman, because right. I think given what Georgia has coming back at quarterback, there's no doubt in my mind Jamie Newman's going to be the starter. And given what they have around him, I don't question whether he's going to have a good season. But I'm just trying to really pump the brakes on Bulldog Nation with his Heisman talk. And a lot of that also doesn't even have to do with Newman. It has to do with the fact that, it just seems like every offseason, what were we saying last year about Kelly Bryant? And, there's several other players of that similar stature where they grad transfer in, The fan base is in an uproar. We're all fired up about these kids. But in year one, yeah, particularly in the SEC, I know Joe Burrow had a huge year last year, but that was his second year, remember, on campus. Their first year on campus at the quarterback position, and the short history of grad transfers in the SEC, they just don't, they don't come in and they're not these all-star talents. So I think given the fact that Georgia should have one of the best, if not the best defense in the nation next year, they're going to be loaded at running back. They got plenty of receiver options. I think that offense is going to be fine, but I just don't think they're going to air it out, light it up, try to go LSU style just because LSU didn't have this defense last year that Georgia's going to have this year. So, and we're still talking about Kirby Smart being the head coach. So I think he's going to be a little bit of conservative, going to rely more on that defense. Jamie Newman's going to be a solid quarterback, but this All-American Heisman talk, I'm not buying any of that at this moment.
Yeah, and I agree with it. And I tell you, it reminds me a little bit, not skill set wise by any stretch of the imagination, but his freshman year reminds me a little bit of the freshman year that Matthew Stafford had. You remember the big touted coming in, everybody was, all about him. Then he got thrown into the fire pretty quickly. And, that year he threw 7 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. I mean, that was nothing spectacular by any stretch of the imagination. But you saw things in him that made you believe, okay, this guy is going to be a ball player. And one thing I like about Bo Nix, I think is really going to help him is, we know that what happens the sophomore year so many times, right? The sophomore slump, if you will, or a drop off of some measure. But he's got something that normally doesn't happen is he's a coach's kid, right? Like his dad's going to have him. He's going to be working. He knows what it takes. It's a little bit different situation. I think Bo Nix is going to come back ready. And more importantly, I think he's got a ton of skill coming back around him. Now, that offensive line is going to be a mess. They've got to figure that out. But at the skill positions, at wide receiver, running back, they got a ton of talent coming back, and that really should be beneficial for them.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I got him so high. And I think the ceiling is very, very high for Bo Nix coming into this season, and I think he's going to prove a lot of people wrong.
Absolutely. Now let's move to number 5, probably the most controversial of the group, and that is how far down you have Jamie Newman, the University of Georgia transfer. What is it that you've seen that's got Jamie Newman at number 5? Is it something that you don't like about him, or you haven't seen enough of him, or is it just you don't like what's around him as much?
No, I think it has a little bit more to do with him. And if anybody missed it, I did do a column on him. It was pretty popular. It was a film study of. I went back and watched every Jamie Newman play I could find on Wake Forest. Not all of them were available, but the vast majority were. And, there was plenty of positives to take away from it. And particularly his downfield accuracy I thought was outstanding at Wake Forest, and his physicality in the run game. He's not a guy that I think is going to be able to blow by many defenders in the SEC at the second and third level, particularly not the safeties and quarterbacks and what have you. But, he'll be able to outrun all the defensive linemen. But, in the SEC, it's just a different animal, So yeah. I just don't think he's going to be quite the game breaker a lot of people are making him out to be. Now, obviously, he's going to be surrounded with a lot more talent than he ever was at Wake Forest. But watching him in some of these big marquee games, I don't know. I'm not seeing where all these people are getting him. I guess maybe it's a little bit more of a reaction of I'm getting just blown away by all these, Jamie Newman for Heisman, because right. I think given what Georgia has coming back at quarterback, there's no doubt in my mind Jamie Newman's going to be the starter. And given what they have around him, I don't question whether he's going to have a good season. But I'm just trying to really pump the brakes on Bulldog Nation with his Heisman talk. And a lot of that also doesn't even have to do with Newman. It has to do with the fact that, it just seems like every offseason, what were we saying last year about Kelly Bryant? And, there's several other players of that similar stature where they grad transfer in, the fan base is in an uproar. We're all fired up about these kids. But in year one, yeah, particularly in the SEC, I know Joe Burrow had a huge year last year, but that was his second year, remember, on campus. Their first year on campus at the quarterback position, and the short history of grad transfers in the SEC, they just don't, they don't come in and they're not these all-star talents. So I think given the fact that Georgia should have one of the best, if not the best defense in the nation next year, they're going to be loaded at running back. They got plenty of receiver options. I think that offense is going to be fine, but I just don't think they're going to air it out, light it up, try to go LSU style, just because LSU didn't have this defense last year that Georgia's going to have this year. So, and we're still talking about Kirby Smart being the head coach. So I think he's going to be a little bit of conservative, going to rely more on that defense. Jamie Newman's going to be a solid quarterback, but this All-American Heisman talk, I'm not buying any of that at this moment.
Now, I want to say for Georgia fans that are upset right now, their faces are red, they're angry at SEC Mike, let me just remind them that he doesn't really have to be that good because this offense was horrific last year. So to be improved, he really doesn't have to be that good. I mean, when you consider the last 6 games they played against SEC opponents, they average 19 points per game. I mean, if they can just get good, stable quarterback play out of him, that, you know, with a new play calling and maybe a little bit more creativity, maybe that's enough to get them over the hump. It isn't necessarily that it's going to be bad. You're just saying pump the brakes on the Heisman talk right now.
Yeah, that's all it is, and I'm getting significant blowback for it. But like I said at the opening, that's what I really believe after watching this kid play and everything I know about him. Nothing against the young man, but I'm just trying to pump the brakes a little bit. And if this makes Georgia fans feel any better, I think most people September 19th pencil in Georgia for a loss there at Alabama. I'm already to go on the record. Georgia's going to win in Tuscaloosa, and I think it's going to be because of that defense.
All right. Now, Mike, if you would, send me the link to that Jamie Newman article, and I want to post it on our social media because I want our listeners to see it, because whether they agree with you or don't agree with you, I want them to see how in detail you get when you're making some of these lists and some of these analysis. So send that to me, and I'm going to share that on our social media if people want to see this breakdown that you've done of Jamie Newman. Now, I want to move on to another list that you have, and of course, this list was done a long time ago. In fact, it was done just after the national championship game. And you listed your 2020 SEC power rankings. And this is the way that you list them. Number 1, LSU. Number 2, Alabama. Number 3, Florida. Number 4, Texas A&M. Number 5, Georgia. Number 6, Tennessee. Number 7, Kentucky. Number 8, Auburn. Number 9, South Carolina. Number 10, Mississippi State. Number 11, Ole Miss. Number 12, Arkansas. Number 13, Missouri. And number 14, Vanderbilt. Now, as I said before, I know this was now 2 months ago. A lot has changed since that time. So is there anybody that has moved significantly or fallen significantly on your power rankings headed into the fall?
Yeah, we're going way back here. January 14th, keep in mind, folks. I mean, I'm sure I'm already getting ripped for this one, but whenever I do these weekly during the season, and I purposely do them as soon as the final SEC game is finished. So I put this out the moment LSU beat Clemson for the national championship. So that was before half the starting roster left for the NFL, before Joe Brady left. So, yeah, definitely LSU is going to get knocked down a peg or two for me. And honestly, I think that probably the biggest riser in my mind, just off the top of the list here, is probably Florida. I'm very high on the Gators, and right behind them, number 5, Georgia. I'd probably bump them up to 2 or 3. I'm looking at putting Florida number 1, Georgia number 2, Alabama number 3, and I was waiting for spring football to conclude to kind of finalize this, but now that it's looking more and more like we're not going to have spring, I think that's probably going to be my top 3 right now: Florida, Georgia, and Alabama.
So as of right now, we've got Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. Now I want to ask you about Florida because obviously they've lost a lot of firepower at wide receiver. And I want to ask you, is that a concern? Now, I know they got a couple guys that have been in that rotation, but they did lose their top 4 receivers. Are you at all nervous about that impacting how well this team does next season?
Well, no, that's certainly a concern because if you go back and look, I believe it was Jesse Simonton of VolQuest did a really good write-up about a month ago on Tennessee and losing their receivers, and he kind of went through found similar teams like Stanford of last season that basically the entire receiving core left and how that affected the offense. But for me, I think that's kind of the value in Dan Mullen. You know, we give him a ton of credit for being a developer of quarterbacks, but one thing that I don't know he gets enough credit for is just the physicality. He gets his complete offensive unit to play for, going back to his days at Mississippi State. They got a lot of continuity returning on that offensive line. I know P. Ryan is gone, but I got a lot of faith in the runners that Florida is returning. So I think, Dan Mullen is a good enough offensive coach where, 1 year he can be, heavy passing team. The next, he can be a heavy running team. And we've already, went on at length about what I think of Kyle Trask going into the year. So if you're telling me that they're going to be, shifting a little bit more to the run game, they got my best quarterback in the SEC and perhaps the best tight end. Let's not forget him, Pitts in the equation. So he's going to step up big time with those receivers leaving. I think Florida's offense is going to be just fine.
Absolutely. And they're still in the Zachary Evans sweepstakes as well, which could possibly help that offense. He's really a big question mark at this point. But my question for you on this Florida offense is, are they going to be good enough to beat Georgia? Because you think back to last season, and they had 3 points going into the fourth quarter. Now, Georgia did what they've done all season long last year, and they took their foot off the throat and let the team back into it, going into a more prevent defense. But when the starting defense was in there and when they were lined up in their regular base formats, they absolutely shut down this Florida offense. Do you believe that Florida will have enough firepower to beat this Georgia team this year?
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't have confidence in anybody to move the ball on Georgia next year. But I think the real question is, how effective is Georgia's offense going to be when they face a defense of Florida's caliber? So, I mean, it could be a real struggle there to put up points. I certainly am not expecting a shootout down there in Jacksonville. But, yeah, I still think, it's so far out, it's impossible to pick the winner of that game. But I think it's a coin flip either way. And I just feel that, in the most recent seasons, I think Georgia's had such a overall talent advantage over the Gators, and they still will in the 2020 season. But I think Florida has closed that gap just enough. And I know I've seen you a big defender of Kirby Smart, and I don't think the man really needs much defending. He's got an outstanding record here, but I just think Dan Mullen is a little bit better X's and O's game day coach. And if you're going to give, I still give, like I said, Georgia the overall advantage when it comes to talent, which I think is the most important thing overall. But the gap there has closed, like I said, and I like Dan Mullen a little bit better on game day. So keeping that in mind, I really do think that game is a toss-up there.
Absolutely. Once again, we're talking to SEC Michael Bratton, from news editor from Saturday Down South and host of that SEC podcast. Mike, I want to talk about one of the teams you had ranked at number 6, a team that I'm pretty high on to make some jumps this year, and I was really hard on, like a lot of people, at the beginning of last year, but saw a lot of progression throughout the year, and that is the University of Tennessee. What are your expectations for Tennessee this season? Can this be a good stepping stone season for them? I know they've got Florida, and you got Florida and Georgia ahead of them, but is this a season where we could see them kind of take another step in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're going to hear a lot of detractors say, the Vols, they did win their final 6 and 7 of the last 8, but they didn't really beat, a truly impressive team during that stretch. So you're going to hear a lot of people say they didn't beat anybody, but given the way they started out, like you alluded to, I'm not ready to say Jeremy Pruitt should have been coach of the year, but I think he probably was second or third in that category just on the way they finished. And it just reminds me a lot of, the turnaround Nick Saban did in Tuscaloosa, like Kirby Smart had there in Athens, where it just seems like once these players adjust to what these coaches that worked under Nick Saban are really asking of them, it just seems like kind of like a flip has been switched. And that's what I see in Tennessee, where even if you go back to that bowl game, they had no business winning that game. But it just seems like the mentality there, do your job, focus on the next play, that has taken hold in Tennessee. And then you take it a step further. I mean, they're bringing everybody back on the offensive line, everybody on the defensive line. I think that, that's something that we don't talk enough about in the, off season. And why would you? There's not a lot of stats you can point to or anything like that. But we're talking about Tennessee going from, like a Sun Belt offensive line 2 years ago to potentially having the SEC's best offensive line in a really relatively short period of time. So I know there's a lot of questions with Jarrett Garantano, and they've lost Juwan Jennings and Marquez Callaway. But if this offensive line lives up to the billing and Jarrett Garantano just doesn't cost Tennessee games, heck, if he didn't cost them Georgia State and BYU game, we're talking about Tennessee being a 10-win team last year. So I think even smart people like yourself, you got a high opinion of Tennessee, but maybe nationally that's not quite there because of that loss to Georgia State. But like I said, this team is very close to being a 10-win team last season, and if they continue to make the strides, they've got the players returning. The recruiting has upticked since Jeremy Pruitt's been there. I think the next step for Tennessee, though, is you kind of hit on it there. Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and don't forget week 2 at Oklahoma. Jeremy Pruitt has got to win at least one of those games to kind of show. I mean, we're going into year 3 of his era there at Knoxville, and I still don't see a signature win on there. I mean, there's some good wins, but still searching for that signature win. And if they get it week 2 at Oklahoma, they play some power SEC football against that weak Pac-12 defense. Oh, man, you better believe the hype train on Rocky Top's going to be rolling pretty hard.
Mike, I got to tell you, I'm an analytics guy. I love looking deep into the statistics and finding patterns and certain trends that teams have because typically they're going to go back to those trends. They're going to go back to those routines. They're going to go back to those analytics. So I love studying the deep analytics, but occasionally there's something that happens that you can't measure inside the analytics. And I've seen that happen with Tennessee last year. It was after that BYU loss, and it seems like perhaps Jeremy Pruitt was losing the locker room. There were people on social media saying things. There were rumors of things that were going on, players that were going to be kicked off. All of this was going on, and something happened where Jeremy Pruitt united this locker room together, and they finally began to buy in to his way and his program and his way of doing things. And you can't see it on the stat sheet, but I believe there was a turnaround there in Knoxville somewhere. Is that something that you sense and that you saw as you were covering Tennessee?
Oh, absolutely, because you saw, a lot of SEC fans may not know this name, but they had a receiver on the team, Jordan Murphy. He didn't do a whole lot during his college career, but he was the one you kind of referenced there. I believe it was after the BYU loss. I mean, I think he tweeted out some kind of joke about, he thought it was funny or what have you, but I mean, he was gone, that next week, and that he was not the only one. There was a couple that left, and I think, all off season and then following the tough start to the season, Jeremy Pruitt really found out, which of the guys that Butch Jones recruited and signed with Tennessee were bought into the program and which ones weren't. And he moved on from the guys that weren't. And that's not to say, it's very easy to take shots at Butch Jones, but a lot of that core of that team last year, I'm talking Nigel Warrior, Daniel Petulli, Juwan Jennings, the list goes on and on. Those were Butch Jones guys. So, there's nothing wrong with those kids. It was just a matter of, are they going to buy in to the Jeremy Pruitt program? And those that did, we saw the potential there. And that kind of, speaks to Jeremy Pruitt, his ability to adapt to those kids. And, you really got to credit. I never heard the entire time he's been at Tennessee, he's never said, well, I got to get my guys in here, or these are my guys. And he's never said any of that. But, I think if he was, if you had him behind closed doors without a mic in the room, he's probably pretty fired up. But the vast majority of this roster now are players that he has handpicked, particularly on that defense. And if he can make the most with some guys that he's inherited that may not particularly fit his scheme, I'm just thinking that, the potential is very bright for what they can do with guys that he's handpicked and developed there on Rocky Top.
Absolutely. And I'll say this last and we'll move on. But, Jeremy Pruitt, I said from the moment they hired him, he's not for everybody, right? Like his personality is not for everybody. Everybody can't tolerate him. But you look at what happens. I mean, he was at Alabama's secondary coach, went to Florida State, a historically great program, and gave them the, statistically the greatest defense they've ever had. Goes to Georgia, helps them get to the next notch. Gets to Alabama, helps them, take the next notch. And statistically, from turnovers and sacks, we're a historic team for Alabama as well. He can get it done, but he has to get the kind of people. And I knew it was going to take a little bit longer, but he's the kind of guy. He's not for everybody, But when he gets his kind of guys, they're usually the kind of guys that'll run through a wall for him as well. Now, I want to move on real quickly to Mike Leach and Lane Kiffin. I said this earlier in the show, and I'll say it again. I'm very, very excited about these two for the simple fact that this league has been so boring with interviews since Steve Spurrier and Les Miles and those guys. Like, they're all cut from that Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, Jeremy Pruitt mindset where you're going to get just little three-word answers and nothing, no real drama, nothing. We've got a soap opera again, and it's in Mississippi. How impressed are you by the hires of Mike Leach and Lane Kiffin?
Oh, I mean, outstanding for everything you just said, and then you throw on top of it. I mean, they're proven track record of winning, and Lane Kiffin, a track record of recruiting. So, when Ole Miss fired Matt Luke, I was against that hire just because, like I said, 4-8 season, nothing to get excited about, but that was a deceiving record. And you mentioned it as well. You like that roster they've got down there. Mississippi State, I was against firing Joe Moorhead, and I know he didn't do a terrific job. I'm not, trying to paint a different light here, but I just think it was incredibly difficult to replace the best coach they ever had. And if you look at the analytics, I mean, he's doing, I believe he was like right on par for what most of the projections had them doing. But obviously, both those programs not where they need to be, and then they turn around. And if you're talking Ole Miss, I don't know about you, but whenever I think about them, I think of flash and style and recruiting. And they just, I mean, at the pep rally, they introduced Lane Kiffin. It was at 10:30 in the morning, I think, and they had open drinks there. I mean, it was like, my goodness, like, this is what these people want. Give them what they want. They're fired up about football again. So, I mean, just on basically every aspect. And then he comes in there and touts, Ole Miss beating Alabama 2 years in a row, and I know how to, what it takes, what these people have. I mean, that was a home run hire from all aspects, if you want to look at it like that. And then flip side to Mississippi State, everything I said against Joe Moorhead, outstanding individual, really nice guy, but the program had been trending in the wrong direction. Now all of a sudden, hire this pirate guy from Washington State who all of a sudden everybody there at Hale State, they're all fired up once again. So, just in a matter of, days, both those fan bases have been just basically flipped upside down, and the sky is blue, the grass is green, and ready for some football. So, and then you throw it on all the wild, crazy stuff. If you're not following Lane Kiffin and Mike Leach on Twitter, you're doing it wrong because, man, they're interesting out there to be sure. But, it's just not only has it made SEC football more interesting, but my goodness, you look up and down the roster of SEC West coaches. I don't think we've ever had a division that's had this much star power at the coaching position. And I'm just, I cannot wait to see how it plays out.
Absolutely. The only thing I'll say that's a negative is this spring, once again, it's going to be harder for those guys to get their systems installed. So fans are going to have to be a little bit more patient, understanding that these are guys that run very different systems than they have been running, and it's going to take a little bit of time to adjust. All right. Once again, we're talking to SEC Mike from Saturday Down South and That SEC Podcast. Mike, once again, I appreciate you taking so much time and being with us. Now, I do want to ask you one more thing before you go. If you had to select three guys right now to be your lead candidates for Heisman Trophy candidates from the SEC, who would those three guys be?
I think I'm going to go with Kyle Trask, number one, just because I think Florida's going to have such an outstanding season, and they tend to give the award these days, it seems like, to the quarterback of the best team. This is probably going to be a pretty hot take here, but I really think Kellen Mond has a chance to have a special season. I know people have been saying that for some time now, so it may not necessarily happen, but I think Kellen Mond, if Texas A&M does as well as I think they will, I think there's an outstanding chance they start the year 10-0. They face at Alabama and then LSU at home, final two. Those games are probably going to decide the SEC West. I would also put Kellen Mond up there. And then, maybe not necessarily third. Maybe I'll put this guy second. Derek Stingley Junior from LSU. I think given what LSU has lost this offseason, I think Stingley's going to have to make a difference. Obviously, already does it defense, a little bit on special teams. he's going to have to play some offense too. So almost, if he has like a Charles Woodson-esque type season where just making plays all over the field, I think he could start to see him get some hype for that award. And you really have to be a player that touches the ball on many aspects if you're a defensive player. And so it's not highly likely that Derek Stingley is going to win the award, but I don't know. I think if LSU has another really great run and he's making plays all over the field, he's going to get plenty of attention.
Yeah, and you mentioned a guy, that's a great pick, by the way. You mentioned a guy, Kellen Mond, that gets so much negative attention. I really don't get it because you got to remember, overall, between rushing and throwing the ball last year, the guy had 3,300 yards, right? But he also played Clemson. He played Georgia. He played LSU. I mean, he played out. I mean, you're talking about some of the best defenses in the country and still put up 3,300 yards. That's really not that bad. Pretty good, really. And I think he's a guy that, can he take the next step? I think that he will, but I do think he gets a lot of undue criticism. What's your opinion on mine?
Yeah, and another thing, that Texas A&M offensive line, they had lost, I believe his name was Jim Turner. He went to the Cincinnati Bengals. He was the offensive line coach 2 years ago. So they were a little bit in flux there with the coaching staff. And that offensive line just, much of the season, I mean, they couldn't even generate much of a running game. They had running backs going down. Then they have Wademeyer, the tight end, emerge. They had the freshman running back emerge. And all of a sudden it kind of clicked a little bit. But, yeah, then like you said, then they'd run into a Georgia or an LSU, and it just kind of they just were never able to get it going against any of the elite teams. And I think if you watch Kellen Mond, if you weren't a Texas A&M fan, you probably did watch him against Clemson or Georgia or Alabama or LSU, just the marquee games. And you could come away from those saying, well, what in the world? This guy's not worth much. But he kind of just more or less did what needed to be done, whether that was hand the ball off and reading it up the line of scrimmage or, making the checkdowns that just were there when the other plays weren't. And, it's not easy to win 8 games in the SEC, but they done it multiple years in a row. Jimbo Fisher seems to be incredibly high on this kid, and that tells me all I need to know about him because it ain't easy to play quarterback for Jimbo Fisher, and he's the one that's the only one that's been doing it there at Texas A&M. And if Texas A&M is finally going to, take up to the level that the fans thought they were going to get when they got Jimbo Fisher, I think it's going to come because Kellen Mond has a big year next year.
Absolutely. Once again, we're talking to SEC Mike from Saturday Down South and that SEC podcast. Now, Mike, appreciate again you taking some time and being with us. Now, Saturday Down South, everybody knows how to get to that website, but could you tell our listeners how they can hear your podcast and how they can find you on social media as well?
Absolutely. So we're on any and all podcast formats. We do have a Twitter, that SEC podcast. We've also got, all the social medias, Instagram and all that. So that's how you can find us. Just go, you can search for that or just search SEC football. It should be the first thing that comes up on every podcast platform. And, I started this thing about 2 years ago, and I never felt like there's plenty of outstanding team-based coverage for podcasts, but I just felt there was a need for a podcast out there that hits on all the teams. So, a lot of these podcasts focus on Alabama or Georgia, right, whoever's winning last year, LSU. We really put a lot of focus on covering all 14 teams. We put out 5 shows a week during the season. We're currently doing 3 a week following the situation here where we're just dying for content thanks to this virus going around. So right, if you're looking to get away from all that dreary stuff, wanting to listen to some SEC football talk, head on over to that SEC podcast on all podcast platforms.
Absolutely. Once again, Mike, we appreciate so much you taking some time and being with us. And listen, I'd love to get you again on the show real soon.
Absolutely, Doctor. Anytime you need me, I'm there for you. And thanks for inviting me. I really do appreciate it.